Keith here. Wanted to make a quick video to cover something that's sort of become a bit of a problem, but there's also a pretty straightforward solution to it. Several years ago, before submodels came along, we had a common practice where people would deliberately create models which had overlapping channels with other models. And by doing so, they were able to effectively create submodels. And it was a really useful technique, and you'd hide these things away. And it would let you achieve very similar outcomes to what we achieve with submodels today, although definitely a lot less rich and capable. Over the last couple of years, we've also obviously been moving more towards a scenario where people are configuring Xlights in order to upload the configuration to their controllers. And we've done a lot of work in a lot of the models to make that simpler. And if you think very carefully about the way in which you build your model and you take into account the constraints that Xlights has around what it can upload, most people are able to build complete shows that are you can configure all of their controllers and they don't need to worry about that sort of stuff. But sometimes people run into situations where that's not possible, and sometimes it's by choice, sometimes it's the model just is built in such a way that that's just not possible, and so they're stuck with these props in their display which they can't configure and upload. And then as we've moved more towards this world where we're trying to get everything to a point where it can be pushed to the controller, this becomes a bit of a grating element in your show where you think, well, I can upload to that controller, but that controller over there, I can only update, I don't know, 50% of it or 70% of it. And then I've got to go in and manually configure it, and it becomes a real pain. And so the question becomes, well, how do you deal with that? How do you solve those problems? And so I'd like to show you a technique. It's not pretty and elegant, but at the same time it solves the problem and it doesn't clutter your display, and it works. So the first one that I've seen this a number of times. People have a mega tree typically, and they'll have a lot of strands on it. They might have 64 or maybe 32 strands, and they might be a person that doesn't like to power inject. It's one of those complexities that they just don't want in their display. And so they make a decision. They say, well, you know what, I'm just going to use two controllers. And so I've got a tree here which is 32 strands of 100 pixels. Maybe you're running 12 volts. 100 pixels runs really nicely. You might even get away with 5 volts if you really turn the brightness down. But what if I wanted to run that across two controllers? How could I achieve that with a tree and set it up and configure it in Xlights? Well, it's fairly difficult to do. If I come over here and let's pick my first controller here and do a visualize on it, and I go to my tree here and I drag it over and I drop it, as you can see, I get 16 ports that are all fine, but then I get 16 ports which are colored in red and not fine. And they're not fine because you cannot stretch 32 ports over a 16 port controller without adding something like an expansion board. And in this case, let's imagine we're not really interested in adding an expansion board, although in practice you probably would. So what can I do? Well, you can actually trick this thing out. And the easiest way to do it is to create what we used to call shadow models. And so as long as I create something that has the same number of pixels but breaks it into two pieces, that will work. So what I can do is I can come up here and grab another one of these trees, and we'll make this 16 strings of 100 pixels, which is effectively the same size as half of this tree. And then we'll come down and we'll drag down and we'll put another tree, and we'll make it 16 strands of 100 pixels. And together these consume the same number of nodes as this one here, and you can see that up here. Where this tree here starts at channel 1, goes to 9600, and tree 2 here has 3200 nodes. So this one here, sorry, has 3200. This one here has 1600. This one here has 1600. So it's the same number of nodes. It's just it's now broken out into two props. And so if we take this first tree, tree 2, let's rename it. And let's call it tree side 1, and let's call this one tree side 2. And tree side 2 follows tree side 1. We sort it by start channels. You can see that's true. And if we change the start channel of this first tree, well, actually, let's not do that. Let's change this tree here to map to the same start channel as these two trees. So we can do that very easily if we go to the start channel here, and we say I want it to be at the start of a model, and we choose the model, which is tree side 1, and we click OK, and now it's complaining. And the reason it's complaining is because this prop here is trying to chain to a non-existent model. Well, nothing is set as the first model. So let's just set this one to start at channel 1, and now everything's happy again. So effectively, this big tree overlaps the channels exactly. And if I click on overlaps checked, you'll see when I click on this tree, these two light up. When I click on this tree, this one lights up because it's half of this tree. And when I click on this one, it stays lit up because it's half of this one. So these two trees are the same thing. And in fact, if I now come in here and do a quick sequence, and I drop, I don't know, something simple like a butterfly on tree side 1, what happens to the big tree? Well, half of it lights up. And if I move it down onto the second one, the other half of it lights up. So you can see how these two smaller trees are just half of the bigger tree from a channels perspective. So now what I can do is I can take these two trees here and I can move them away out of this preview. So if I go down here and bulk edit the preview, I can move it to the unassigned preview and they now disappear. So now all I've got is this main tree. And if I go to the unassigned preview, there's my other two trees hidden away out of the way. Now if I want to upload this tree to the controllers, I can go back to my controllers, go to my first one, go to the visualizer, and instead of dragging the tree on, what I can do is I can drag on these shadow models. So if I drag the first one onto the first one, that fits nicely. So we'll close that, and now I can go to my second controller. I can click on the visualizer, I can grab side 2 and drag it onto that tree. And now if I do the upload, I'll get a warning because of the model here that's mapped to the channels that are on that controller but not actually being uploaded. But the upload will work correctly. It will configure the controller correctly. And basically I've now managed to span this tree across two controllers but still take advantage of the upload. So it's quite a useful technique for solving a problem that otherwise looked difficult to solve. And when it comes time to sequence over here, get into your display elements and you can either just click on the eyeballs here to hide it, or you can actually drag these things out, because you don't actually ever need to sequence it. You can just sequence the regular tree. You don't need to deal with it in the sequence, unless of course you really want to sequence half of the tree at a time, in which case knock yourself out. So that's the first one. Let me show you this one. This one's slightly different. This is a custom model. It's kind of hard to see, but it's actually a bauble. These are the baubles that I have in my window. And these are a little bit challenging. They're effectively a wireframe. They've got that sort of vinyl tinsel type stuff through it to give it a color during the daytime. And I've punched a bunch of pixels through the middle, and around the outside there is it's like ribbon light, except it's kind of got an opaque dome on top of it, so it looks like more like a rope light. And the pixels are 5 volts, and the surround is in 12 volts. And I need to run them at slightly different brightness levels. And this is a problem. I run them off one channel, so that's not hard, but I need to run half of it at one brightness level and half of it at another brightness level. And to do that, you want to set it up on the controller as two virtual strings, one with the brightness set low and one with the brightness set high. Now, if I want to upload that to the controller, well, how do I achieve that? Well, it's kind of difficult because you can't set those properties. You've only got one set of properties here for the brightness, and if I apply the brightness, it will apply it to the whole prop. So again, though, a similar concept works. In this case, there is 100 pixels, 50 5 volts and 50 12 volts. So what we'll do is we'll drag down two strings. One of them will be represent the 5 volts and one of them will represent the 12 volts. Now the 12 volt one, let's call this one bauble dash 5 volts, and let's call this one bauble dash 12 volts. And now we can come down here and we can set the properties. And so the first thing we want to set on this one is we want to set the brightness, and let's say we want to run this one at 30%. So done. Now obviously I need to get the start channels to overlap, and obviously to do that, let's imagine it's connected to the 5 volts first and then it goes to the 12 volts. So I need to set the start channel of this particular prop to be the start of the 5 volt strand of pixels. I do that. And now with my overlaps checked, when I click on this, it overlaps perfectly with these two strings. When I click on one of the strings, it overlaps. So these two are fully covering the bulbs that are in this here as well. Next thing I want to do is do that bulk edit again, change the preview, move them to unassigned. We don't need to see them. They're now here. We can put these wherever we like here. It doesn't really matter. We're not going to use them. We're not going to sequence them. This is what we're going to sequence. So now let's go back to our controller, and I'm going to, we'll just do it on this control here. We'll take our tree off. And so now what I need to do is I need to set this up. So let's imagine this bauble's running off port 1. We said the 5 volt pixels were first, so we drag the 5 volt pixels across, and then we drag the 12 volt pixels across. And you can see that Xlights has said, those two things need to be on a separate virtual string. Why? Well, because this one here has the brightness not set at all, which means it defaults to 100%, and this one has the brightness set to 30%. And so it knows that means that on this controller, a Falcon controller, you need to split those two things across virtual strings in order to set the brightness separately. And now I can upload it. Again, in the sequencer, when it comes time to sequence, again, I don't want to see these 12 volts and 5 volts, nor do I want to see my two sides of my tree. I just want to see my B1, which is my bauble, and so I can sequence it as a single bauble, but it will upload correctly and it will run correctly off my controller. And so if I'm using ZCPP or I'm using any one of the other upload mechanisms, it will now all upload, correctly configure my controller, and I don't have to keep worrying about every time I do an upload going and checking that the virtual strings are still there and they're in the right place, etc. So yeah. So it is a problem that's solvable. It's not necessarily obvious, and I realize that shadow models are not a common thing that people use these days. Of course, if I run check sequence, it will give me errors. Sorry, bring that up. It's going to give me my overlap errors, right? What do you know? Some serious overlap errors, probably more overlap errors than I expected, because I think I haven't separated my tree and my baubles. But yeah. And yes, I haven't actually, the tree, yeah, I haven't. But yeah, this bauble here, the baubles overlapping with the 12 volt and 5 volt lines are exactly what you would have expected. And you'll always get that now. And you just need to realize that, well, hang on a second, that's actually deliberate. And maybe you want to give it a name. Maybe you want to say this is a shadow model, so that when you're looking in the check sequence and you see a bunch of overlaps relating to shadow models, you can ignore them. Or maybe we can all agree that we'll put shadow into the name, and we can make check sequence smart enough to ignore models which have shadow in the name and not flag them for those people that are a little OCD about getting a clean check sequence. So I hope you learned something, guys. Hopefully maybe that helps you get your show set up even better, and maybe if you're not currently taking advantage of the uploading of the configuration to your controllers, maybe that's something you want to consider getting working this year. So thanks a lot, guys.